Close your eyes. Imagine the sun isn't a source of life, but a predatory beast. You are kneeling. The sand beneath your knees is 120 degrees, cooking your skin. Around your neck is a cold, heavy iron collar, and the chain attached to it jerks with every sob of the woman behind you. A shadow falls over you. You look up, hoping for mercy, but you only see a man's hand reaching for your face. He forces your jaw open. He isn't looking for a smile. He's inspecting your teeth like a horse trader at a Sunday market. He's checking your tongue for rot, your eyes for fire, your body for a price tag. 2 weeks ago, you were a person. You had a name, a mother, a village, and a future. Now, you are Jaria, a slave girl, a piece of inventory. And the journey you are about to take is so horrific that history, for over 1,000 years, has tried to pretend your footprints never existed. Today, we go where the world is afraid to look. This is the story of the Arab slave trade, and why, for the African woman, it was a reality far worse than death. The gendered selection process was the foundational cruelty of the Arab slave trade, where the human body was treated as a calculated financial asset. Unlike the Atlantic trade, which prioritized male labor for plantations, this system was built on a voracious demand for African women. Traders looked for specific physical markers, treating the transition from personhood to property as a rigorous mechanical evaluation of flesh. Every woman was viewed through a lens of potential utility, focusing on her reproductive years and her aesthetic appeal to high-end buyers. This selection wasn't merely about finding workers, it was about curating a collection of lives for domestic and private service. It was the first step in a systematic stripping of dignity that defined the entire 300-year history of the trade. The evaluation process often began in the dust of a raided village, or at a coastal collection point, where families were ruthlessly torn apart. Men who were too old or deemed unfit for the grueling journey were often executed on the spot to save on precious water and food. Women, however, were subjected to an invasive physical inspection that mirrored the appraisal of livestock in a common market. Their teeth were checked for age and strength, their eyes for clarity, and their limbs for the endurance needed to cross the desert. A woman's worth was determined by a stranger's fingers pressing into her gums and skin, searching for any hidden flaw or disease. This clinical detachment from human suffering allowed the merchants to view their captives as nothing more than breathing merchandise. Age was the most critical variable in this dark equation, with traders specifically hunting for girls between the ages of 13 and 25. This demographic was considered the sweet spot of the trade because they were young enough to survive the Sahara and old enough for immediate use. A girl too young would be a drain on resources for years before she could be profitable, while a woman too old had a shorter shelf life. These young women were forced to endure a terrifying reality where their youth was not a blessing, but a curse that made them more valuable. The traders knew that a young woman could serve a household for decades, providing both labor and children for the master's lineage. Consequently, the youth of Africa was drained away to fuel the domestic comfort of empires thousands of miles away. Physical appearance and regional origin created a tiered pricing system that further dehumanized these women into categorized luxury goods. In the bustling markets of Cairo and Zanzibar, women from regions like Ethiopia often commanded premium prices due to specific aesthetic preferences. These high-value captives were sometimes given marginally better food or lighter chains during the march, but never out of a sense of human kindness. It was purely a business decision to protect the investment and ensure the product didn't spoil before reaching the final auction block. A scarred or sickly woman meant a loss in profit, so their bodies were maintained with the same cold care a soldier might give to his rifle. This commodification meant that a woman's survival was entirely dependent on how much wealth her physical form could generate. Finally, the selection process served as the ultimate tool for the destruction of the African family unit and the erasure of identity. By selecting only the most desirable women and separating them from their brothers and fathers, the traders ensured that no community could be rebuilt. The women were sent into isolation in foreign households where they had no allies, no shared language, and no hope of seeing their kin again. This intentional fragmentation made resistance almost impossible, as each woman had to face her new, horrific reality completely alone. The merchandise was chosen not just for what it could do, but for the ease with which its past could be completely obliterated. By the time the selection was over, the woman as a human being had died, leaving only the slave to begin the journey. The Trans-Saharan crossing was not a mere journey but a calculated gauntlet of death that stretched across the world's most unforgiving landscape. For the enslaved African women, the Sahara was a 2,000-mile graveyard where the horizon offered nothing but the promise of heat and exhaustion. This was a trek measured in the rhythm of iron chains clinking against bone and the desperate gasps of those whose lungs were filled with dust. The route from the Sahel to the Mediterranean coast took months, forcing captives to walk through sand that reached temperatures capable of blistering bare feet instantly. Every mile was a test of survival where the environment acted as a secondary executioner for the weak and the weary. There was no shade to be found, only a relentless sun that turned the desert into a vast, open-air furnace. Logistics in the desert were dictated by the survival of transport animals, while the human cargo was treated as entirely secondary and expendable. Camels were the lifeblood of the caravan, and because they were expensive to replace, they were always given priority at the rare, brackish watering holes. Women were forced to wait until the animals had finished drinking, often receiving only a few drops of water that did little to soothe their swollen tongues. Hunger was a constant, gnawing companion, as the rations provided were just enough to prevent the heart from stopping, but never enough to sustain strength. Those who could no longer keep pace with the camels were not given rest or medical attention by the traders. Instead, the economics of the desert dictated that any merchandise that slowed the collective march was a liability to be discarded. The physical toll of the Sahara was compounded by the extreme fluctuations in temperature that occurred the moment the sun dipped below the dunes. During the day, the women suffered under a 120-degree heat that turned their skin into a map of cracks and bleeding sores. Yet, when night fell, the desert turned into a frigid wasteland where temperatures plummeted below freezing, leaving the scantily clad captives to shiver uncontrollably. This constant cycle of boiling and freezing shattered the immune systems of even the strongest women, leading to pneumonia and shock. Many would lay down at night to find a moment of peace, only to never wake up when the caravan prepared to move at dawn. The silence of the desert night was often broken only by the sound of those who were slowly slipping away into a permanent sleep. Historians and explorers who traveled these same routes centuries later described a haunting trail marked not by milestones, but by bleached human remains. The road was literally paved with the skeletons of those who had succumbed to the journey, their bones serving as a grim navigation system. Skulls and rib cages were often found clustered around dry wells, evidence of the final, desperate moments of those who reached for water that wasn't there. Because the caravans could not afford to stop for burials, the bodies were left where they fell, to be picked clean by scavengers and mummified by the salt. These white bones stood in stark contrast to the orange sands, acting as a silent, eternal testimony to a tragedy the world chose to ignore. Every step a survivor took was literally over the remains of those who had been their friends, sisters, or mothers. For the women who managed to reach the northern ports, survival was a victory of the spirit that carried a heavy psychological price for the future. They arrived at the markets of Tripoli or Cairo with bodies that were hollowed out by the sun and eyes that had seen the unthinkable. The crossing had stripped them of their connection to their homeland, leaving the vast, empty desert as a wall between their past and their present. They knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back, as no human could survive that journey twice without the support of a caravan. The Sahara had acted as a filter, allowing only those with the most resilient constitutions to pass through its burning gates into a life of servitude. While the physical walk was over, the internal desert they carried within them would remain for the rest of their stolen lives. The erasure of African history in the Middle East was achieved through a systematic and brutal medical intervention known as the Castration Paradox. While the Atlantic trade resulted in millions of descendants who kept their culture alive, the Arab trade relied on the mass sterilization of its male captives. This was not a random act of cruelty, but a deliberate economic and social policy designed to prevent the formation of a permanent African diaspora. By ensuring that male slaves could never reproduce, the ruling classes eliminated the risk of a growing underclass that might one day demand rights. This mechanical removal of a future generation is the primary reason why so little visual evidence of this massive migration exists today. It was a trade designed from its very inception to be a one-way street ending in a complete genetic dead end. The process of creating a eunuch was a horrific ordeal that took place at specific transit hubs along the Nile and the Saharan routes. Because Islamic law technically prohibited the act of mutilation, Arab traders often outsourced this bloody task to third-party agents, including certain Coptic monasteries. Young boys and men were subjected to total or partial removal of their reproductive organs, without any modern form of anesthesia or sanitation. The survival rate was catastrophically low, with historians estimating that 80 to 90% of those operated upon died from blood loss or sepsis. If a merchant needed 100 living eunuchs to sell at the palace, he would have to sacrifice nearly 500 lives to get them. These men died screaming in the dirt, their lives discarded as the cost of doing business, in a market that demanded sterile labor. For the women of the trade, this policy created a unique and isolating social environment where they were the only ones left to carry their heritage. They were often surrounded by castrated men who could offer no protection and no possibility of forming a traditional family unit within their shared culture. This lack of a male counterpart meant that African women were forced into total dependency on their Arab or Ottoman masters for any sense of survival. The absence of a self-sustaining community meant that there were no neighborhoods or villages where African traditions could be secretly preserved or passed down. The woman became a solitary island of her own history, with no one to help her carry the heavy burden of her stolen identity. This isolation was a refined form of psychological control that ensured the slave remained entirely focused on the needs of the owner. The demographic impact of this policy was so total that it effectively whitewashed the history of the regions that imported millions of Africans. Unlike in the Americas, where the slave population grew through natural birth, the Middle Eastern slave population was constantly dying out and being replaced. This required a continuous 300-year cycle of fresh raids into the African interior to keep the labor force and the harems fully stocked with new bodies. When a male slave died, his line ended with him. When a female slave died, her children were often already absorbed into the dominant culture. This created a ghost-like presence in the historical record, where millions of people are known to have arrived, yet almost no one is left to claim them. The castration of the men was the key that locked the door on the possibility of an African future in these lands. Ultimately, the castration paradox serves as the darkest explanation for why the Arab slave trade remains a forgotten or hidden chapter of global history. Without a large and vocal group of descendants to build museums or demand apologies, the tragedy remains buried beneath the shifting sands of the desert. The silence of the millions who were never born is far louder than any written record, yet it is a silence that most modern societies find easy to ignore. The women who survived were forced to watch as the very memory of their people was systematically bred out or cut away by the knife. They lived with the knowledge that they were the last of their kind, destined to be forgotten by a world that valued their bodies but hated their history. This was the final, most efficient horror of the system, the total and absolute erasure of a people's existence. For a woman arriving at the gates of a royal palace or a wealthy merchant's home, the ordeal transitioned from physical survival to a total psychological erasure. The institution of the harem was far from the romanticized fantasy often depicted in Western literature. It was a sophisticated engine designed to strip away every shred of a captive's original identity. From the moment she crossed the threshold, her birth name was discarded in favor of a new, often descriptive Arabic name, signaling that the person she used to be was officially dead. She was forbidden from speaking her native tongue, forced instead to adopt the language of her captors to communicate her basic needs. This linguistic isolation ensured that she could no longer even think in the sounds of her homeland, effectively cutting the final cord to her ancestors. Her life became a blank slate upon which her master would write a new, subservient history. The hierarchy within the harem was a brutal and competitive landscape where African women were forced to navigate complex power dynamics just to secure their basic safety. Unlike domestic slaves who labored in the kitchens or fields, those chosen for the private quarters were subjected to a life of constant surveillance and rigid behavioral codes. They were taught how to walk, how to serve, and how to anticipate every whim of a master who held absolute power over their life and limb. There was no concept of personal space or consent, as their bodies were viewed as property to be utilized at the owner's discretion without question. While some women managed to climb the social ladder through wit or the birth of a child, the vast majority lived in a state of quiet, constant desperation. The psychological toll of this existence was a heavy, invisible chain that bound them more tightly than any iron collar ever could. If a woman bore her master a child, her status changed under the Islamic legal concept of walad, or mother of a child. But this was a hollow victory. While the law technically forbade her master from selling her and granted her freedom upon his death, it also solidified her role as a permanent fixture of his household. Her children were born legally free and were often raised as members of the Arab elite, but this meant they were culturally separated from their mother's African heritage. She was forced to watch her own children grow up speaking the language of her oppressors and practicing the traditions of those who had enslaved her. The children became the final stage of her erasure, as they were absorbed into the master's lineage, while her own lineage was effectively terminated. She remained a shadow in the corner of a grand house, a mother to children who could never truly know where she came from. This system of domestic slavery was a machine that produced a specialized type of loneliness, where women were surrounded by people but remained entirely alone in their grief. The identity death meant that even if she were to escape, there was no longer a person to go back to, as the village and family she knew had been destroyed or forgotten. The specialized training she received was designed to make her a perfect tool for her environment, but it left her hollow and disconnected from her own soul. Every ritual, every prayer, and every commanded smile was a brick in the wall that separated her from her true self. She existed in a state of permanent mourning for a life that was stolen when she was just a girl, a life that no one around her even acknowledged had existed. Her survival was not an act of living, but a long, slow process of vanishing into the background of another person's world. Ultimately, the harem and the domestic household served as the final stage of the Arab slave trade's goal, the total integration of the captive, until they were invisible. Because there were no separate slave quarters or distinct communities, the African presence was gradually dissolved into the general population through these compelled unions. Unlike the segregated systems of the West, this model of absorption left no cultural footprint of the millions of women who were brought across the desert. Their songs, their stories, and their very blood were blended into the dominant society until all traces of their African origin were gone. The woman became a silent ancestor to a people who would never claim her, her suffering buried beneath the luxury and politics of the empires she helped sustain. She died having lived a reality worse than death, forgotten by the history books and the very children she brought into the world. The legacy of the Arab slave trade is not found in marble monuments or grand museums, but in a haunting and absolute silence that stretches across continents. While the Atlantic trade left behind a vibrant and vocal diaspora that forces the world to remember its pain, the East African and Trans-Saharan trades left only an empty void. There are no national holidays to commemorate the 14 million who were lost, and no statues stand in the squares of Cairo or Riyadh to honor their struggle. This absence of memory is the final victory of a system that was designed to consume human beings without leaving a single trace behind. The desert has a way of burying the truth as effectively as it buries the bones, leaving modern generations with a history that feels more like a myth. For the African woman, this meant that her suffering was not just a lived experience, but a story that would be systematically erased from the world's conscience. In the Middle East today, the lack of a distinct African descended population is the most chilling evidence of how successful the erasure truly was. In the Americas, 45 million people stand as living proof of the Atlantic trade, their very existence a daily reminder of the history that brought them there. In contrast, the millions of Africans taken to the Arab world were either biologically terminated through castration or culturally absorbed until their heritage vanished. There are no African quarters in the great cities of the Middle East, and the few scattered communities that do exist are often marginalized and ignored by the broader historical narrative. This lack of visibility allows modern societies to bypass the difficult conversations about reparations, guilt, or the lasting impact of over 1,000 years of human trafficking. The silence is not accidental, it is a structural byproduct of a trade that favored total assimilation over the preservation of a separate slave class. When archaeologists occasionally uncover mass graves in the Libyan desert, they find the remains of people who have no names, no records, and no one to mourn them. These are the ghosts of the sand, individuals who died mid-journey and were immediately forgotten by the merchants who viewed them only as lost revenue. Unlike the ship manifests of the Middle Passage, which often recorded numbers and sometimes names, the caravan records of the Sahara were notoriously inconsistent and frequently non-existent. This means there is no central archive where a descendant could go to trace their lineage or find the village their ancestors were stolen from. The victims were stripped of their history and life, and they have been denied a place in the historical record in death. The sand has literally swallowed the evidence of 1,000 years of crime, leaving only the wind to whisper the names of the millions who perished. The global educational system further complicates this silence by focusing almost exclusively on Western slavery, while treating the Arab trade as a footnote or a taboo subject. Children in schools across the world learn about the brutality of the cotton fields, but they are rarely told about the Egyptian monasteries that served as castration centers. This imbalance in historical focus creates a hierarchy of suffering, where the victims of the East are treated as less significant than the victims of the West. Political and religious sensitivities often prevent researchers from diving deep into the archives of the Ottoman or Safavid empires to bring these stories to light. Consequently, the African woman who suffered in a Baghdad harem remains an invisible figure, her trauma unacknowledged by the modern world's push for social justice and historical transparency. The world has chosen to look away, making the desert's silence even more profound and heartbreaking. Ultimately, the only memorial these 14 million souls will ever receive is the conscious effort of those who refuse to let the fire of their memory go out. We must recognize that the silence of the sand is a call to action for historians, storytellers, and truth seekers to dig beneath the surface of sanitized history. Remembering the woman who knelt in the sand is an act of rebellion against a system that spent 13 centuries trying to make us forget she ever lived. Every time her story is told, a brick is removed from the wall of silence that has protected the legacy of the Arab slave trade for far too long. We owe it to the bones in the desert to speak the words they were never allowed to say, and to acknowledge a reality that was in every sense worse than death. Only by breaking this silence can we finally give a voice to the millions who were erased by the wind and the dunes.